We are going to design a stand for a pair of over-the-ear headphones. So our headphones themselves, the band that goes over the head, and we're going to be hanging them from some kind of hook, which is going to need an arm that goes all the way down, longer than the length of the headphones, and a base that is wide enough that nothing will tip over when we hang our headphones on there. This is a fairly large piece, which means we're going to need to design our part to be disassembled so that we can print it in several pieces. Just thinking about it in this way, if I were to print it standing up, we would have our layers all going in this direction, making the arm the weakest in the direction that we want to be pulling on it. Since we don't want this to snap in half, we'll probably want to print our arm lying flat on the surface of our printer. That way, all of our layers are going to go in this direction along the length of the arm, making it a lot stronger. The base will also probably be fairly wide, and we don't want to be printing it here and building a lot of supports to hold up the hook. So we'll make our arm and our base two separate objects with a slot in there so that the two pieces can fit together. We are going to design our two-part headphone stand here. Starting with some fairly simple shapes. Should be fairly quick to construct. Go ahead and move my example off to the side here. And we're going to start out making our base. I'm going to make this out of a sphere. And while you could make this base quite simply out of a cylinder, I'm just using the steps on the sphere. It allows me to change this, the number of sides. Let's zoom in here for a bit. And as I go down in steps, we get a nice, interesting geometric shape. I'm going to go to 7. And I'm going to squash this shape down a little bit so that we are only, say, move this down as well. Since I need a flat bottom on here, I'm going to go until I have a ring of sides here that is straight up and down so that the edge is nice and flat. And then I'm going to change our sides here to make this wide enough. I'm going to go click on the corner to allow me to change both directions at once. And instead of just dragging it out and trying to guess, I'm going to change these numbers by clicking on them and typing in, let's go for 150, and then hit tab and 150. There we go. So even though it went off the screen, I was able to change these simply hitting tab for the next one. And now we can see that the height of my sphere here is 14 millimeters. However, the actual height is only half that since I've pushed half of it down through the ground. So I think I will increase this a little bit to 20 so that we should have about a 10 millimeter thick base. If I want it to be exactly 10, I know that I can use this measurement here, put it at -10, so it's 20 tall, and we've gone down 10. All right, now we have the size of our base, and I know that this will fit in the printer since the printer I have is larger than this default work plane. But if you want to design your shapes specifically to fit on your printer, you can go into the edit grid here and change the dimensions of the work plane so that it matches the floor of the printer. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the bottom half of this off so that when I print it, it's going to be a nice flat surface on the bottom. We're going to grab a box here that's already set to hole, where we can set anything to a solid or a hole in its shape menu there. And we're going to drag the corner out so it covers up the entire thing. At this point, we would cut the top half off, which is possible. I can cut the top half and flip it over. But I can also simply take my up and down, or not up and down, my size handle on the top here and drag it down past 0 and out the other side. So now I have a box that starts at 0 and goes down. And I can go ahead and select both of these objects and group them together. So now I have a interesting faceted surface for my base, and we're going to build up an arm that is going to hold up our headphones. And since I want this to have a nice angle on it, I won't start with a box, but instead I will head over here and start with the wedge. So let's go ahead and make our wedge shape lined up in the center of this. I will select both of them and use the align tool here, and we'll align them in the center. Now I can click on an empty space, select my wedge again, and let's zoom in a bit so we can see this a little more clearly. It's always good to zoom in when you're trying to pick a specific handle so that you don't accidentally pick the wrong thing. So we're going to stretch this out a bit. I don't think I want it to overhang that much. And then we're going to increase the height. And I know I want this to be over 20 centimeters. So we're going to make this 200, or we'll make it 220 millimeters. So it's 22 centimeters tall. Should be long enough to support the headphones without them touching the ground. So now I have the basis of my arm here, but I'm going to need to add a hook, and I'm going to add another section out here so that it has a little bit of extra support. That way we aren't pulling down on anything particularly narrow, having a weak point in our arm. So for extra support, I'm going to duplicate this wedge. Let's just hit duplicate and repeat. That's going to make a copy in the exact same spot as the original. And I'm going to click on our fit to view to zoom right into this object. And I'll click on this handle and we'll do the same trick of going past and out the other side. So now I have a support going this way, but I don't want it to go all the way up. So I'll take my height measurement and drag it down until I just have this extra support at the base. That looks good. I need to do the same thing on the other side, but I want to have a nice curve here. So I think I will use a cylinder or just the round roof shape. So we can take the round roof, which you can see is just half of a cylinder, and we can flip it over so that it has the curve that we want here. So let's look at it from the top. In order to use the rotate tool here to turn it to the side, I'm going to keep it inside the circle so I can snap it to 90 degrees. If we go outside the circle, remember that this will move it 1 degree at a time, which is good if you need to line something up exactly the way you want it. But once you do this, it will forget what number you have moved it to. So if I have rotated this 13 degrees and I click somewhere else and I want it to line up straight again, I will not know how far to go. So I'll have to undo this until it's lined up again. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I can rotate this 90 degrees, but I could also, since it's symmetrical, just go to mirror and look at it so that I can flip it upside down. Now I want my shape to be at the top at this 22 millimeter mark. So we're going to hold down Shift and select the tallest part of our arm. And we're going to use our Align tool again. We can see that if I click on the circles now, they're going to move the arm and my little round roof shape. I want the arm to stay in position, so I will click on the wedge, and all of my alignment tools move to the wedge. So now I can click on the top circle to line up the top of this with the top of that. We'll move over here, and I'll click on my middle, and we'll go ahead and click on the edge here, so they're lined up. Now I've got this on the wrong side of my wedge, but that's okay. Since I have all of these edges lined up, I can click on an empty space to deselect. We'll click on our shape here, and we'll go ahead and grab our length control here and stretch it out in the other direction. So now you can clearly see that this shape is not going to support anything with that tiny little connection there. So we're going to need to add something in here to support it, and we've got a handy wedge here that we can just flip over, stick on the underside. So let's go ahead and duplicate this wedge. I will use the mirror tool and flip it upside down. Oops. Be careful if you click on anything else besides one of the arrows, you'll select it instead. So let's try that once more. We'll select this guy, mirror tool, and flip it upside down. Now I'm going to raise this up so I can use the handle here that floats above the top of it. And I can also hold down Control on my keyboard and hit the up and down arrows to move this up and down relative to the work plane. So now we have still a fairly narrow point right there. I don't quite like how this is shaped. So what I'm going to do is extend our arm up a little bit. And this way, we have a thicker area here where it connects. But we also have this extra spike up here that we don't really want. It could be perfectly fine design, since this would keep our headphones from sliding off the back, but does make the arm a lot longer, and if we make something too long to fit on our printer, we're going to have to cut it somewhere in the middle and reassemble it after it's been printed. So instead, I'm going to cut this entire shape off, and I think I'll make, while I'm looking at this, I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. So if I look at it from the bottom, I can just drag my height down so that the whole thing becomes thicker. And I'm going to use this to cut out a nice curve through the whole thing so that it has a dip in there, and that'll keep our headphones from sliding off in either direction. So let's duplicate this one in place. We'll turn our duplicate that we have selected into a hole, and then we'll go ahead and I'm going to use Control and the arrow keys to move it up. Then we will take our length measurements here and stretch it out in both directions so that we end up with not too steep of a slope there. And this is going to give us our top curve, but it's not going to get rid of all of this extra. So let's bring out another hole to get rid of the excess material on the top that we don't want to be part of this. If I were to group this together right now, even though this cuts this section separate from the other, it doesn't consider this a separate object. You can't move it or delete it on its own. If I move this, everything moves with it, including the gap. So I'll undo that. And we'll go ahead and add ourselves another hole up here. Oops, there we go. Now if I bring out a box, I can go ahead and move it up here with the tools that we've used before. But a shorter way to do that, since I know I want to put it on top of this hole, I can click on the work plane tool and drag it out and place it on a surface. You can see that I can put it on the side of things. I'm going to place it right on the top of my existing hole. Now I have an orange work plane that is set up in space. All of our measurements and movements are relative to the work plane, so if I drag a new box out, it is going to drop it right on the new work plane. Now I can drag it out so that it's big enough to cover up the area we want to cut off. And now I can take the work plane tool and drag it to an empty space, and it will snap back to the original blue work plane. There we go. Now we can drag a box around all of our holes and all the way down to make sure that we get this extra support strut right there, and group everything together. Now our arm has a nice scoop at the top. Everything is looking good. If I combined these two shapes, then I would have one single solid object that could be printed if it fits in the printer. But this would not be the strongest direction to print our arm, as well as requiring a lot of supports here. So instead, we're going to use our arm to cut a notch out of our base. Now, if I were to duplicate this arm right now, just as I've done in several other instances, and turn the duplicate into a hole, I could use it holding down Shift and selecting the base. We could group them together and cut out a hole in the base. But right now, this hole goes all the way to the ground, which means once I slide this on here, there's nothing really to keep it from moving up. And I want these two parts to join together so that once they are attached, there's no way this is going to wobble or tilt forward or anything. So let's undo that last move. And instead of cutting a hole that goes all the way to the floor, I want this to be almost all the way to the floor. Let's delete that and add a box to use to cut a notch out of our arm. So I'm going to scoot this over to the side so that I can see this one. And we're going to cut a notch out of here that is, we'll say, 3 millimeters tall. Now I can use my other handles to stretch it out. And we'll go ahead and cut off 3 millimeters from just the front side, not all the way back, because I want this part to go all the way to the floor as it sticks out the back of our base. Now, selecting these two, even though this one is already a group, I can always group again. So when you add another shape into an existing group, it nests the groups. This is important to remember because if I want to change things, and I ungroup this, I'm only going to go down one group. You can see that I have ungrouped the shape and the arm. But if I select this, I can ungroup again to get all the individual pieces that were inside of the arm. So let's go ahead and group this one more time. Now we're going to move our base back into position. And I've been using the arrow keys. That way I know I haven't moved it side to side by accident. But if you move it around anywhere else, we can always go back to the Align tool and make sure that they are centered. Now I have my arm sticking just off the side of my base. I'm going to select this arm and create a duplicate. We'll turn this duplicate into a hole, and I'm going to add one more step before cutting it out. At this point, I could cut it out and have an exact size shape of this as a negative hole to fit it in, but there can be some expansion on the edges. The printer is not absolutely perfectly precise. That could mean that I would have to do a bunch of sanding or extra work to try to get this to fit in place. If I want to have an assurance that it'll fit, I'm going to make the hole just a little bit bigger. So we'll go ahead, since it's going to slide in from one side, I just need to make it wider in both directions. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and select this and just make it 1 millimeter bigger. So we'll make it 21. And we'll hold down Shift to select the base. And we'll use our Line tool to line it up in the center. This means if we zoom in here so that we can see it, that our hole is now 0.5 millimeter bigger on both sides. So we shouldn't have much trouble fitting our shape in once it's cut. Since I still have these two shapes selected, I'm going to go ahead and group them. Let's try that once more. Group. There we go. All right. Now we have a shape with a hole to fit the base in there and the arm. And since the arm is flat on both sides, we can easily rotate it 90 degrees and hit D to drop it on the ground. We can see that we have two parts that can be printed, and our arm will be printed in a strong direction, and the base will be printed flat. We can go ahead and use these techniques to create whatever kind of experimental shape that you want. You can use things that, well, this one might not actually be very functional in plastic. If it was made of a more rigid material, it could work. But trying out prototypes with interesting shapes will get you some pretty crazy results. We will make sure that these are going to fit on our printer and set them up to print. We are going to set up our two-part headphone stand for printing. We've already laid the arm down on its side, and we could select both of these objects and export them as a single STL file and send them for printing. But if we do, then we can't change their position in relation to each other, like moving them closer together, and we'd have to rotate them as one group instead of individually to try to fit them onto the surface of the printer. So let's select our base by itself and export it using only the selected shape. Create this STL file. Then we're going to select the arm of our stand here and export it as well, only the selected shape, and create another STL file. They'll both have the same name since TinkerCAD gives them the name of the project, but our second one just has a 1 after it. So now we have our two separate STLs. We're going to head over to our slicer. I'm going to open up Cura. And now, with our printer and our plastic type selected, we're going to open the headphone stand, both pieces at once. And we'll see that we have both shapes here take up a lot of space. One of them is off the side of the printer. So I'm going to right click on a space here and we'll click on Arrange All Models. And it's going to try and arrange them in some way. It doesn't seem to be able to do it. So let's zoom out here. We'll select the arm and the move tool. And we'll move it around so that it will fit on the surface of the printer. And here you can see that we can fit both of our shapes. And they are blue on the bottom, meaning they're both touching the floor. However, even at our fastest printing speed, if I slice the two of these at once, we can see this is going to be a 10-hour print job. And while that might not be a problem, there could be an issue where we lose power or a temperature change causes something to happen in our shapes. And that's going to mean that we will lose both of our shapes as it stops printing halfway through the two of them. So if we remove our arm here from the picture and slice this, we'll see that we have almost 6 hours here to print our base since it's so wide, but we won't actually be in danger of losing the arm. So let's print the base as a singular piece. And if we look at the preview here, you can see that even though there's a slight slope here, it's not enough of an overhang to need supports. So we'll be able to print this whole thing without supports. And as we have printed it at the low quality or the very tallest layer height setting, 0.28 millimeters, each layer is going to be a little bit of a step up. For now, that goes well with my faceted design. I'm going to go ahead and keep that. And scrolling down just to make sure that everything is as it seems and we don't have any weird holes that we weren't expecting. So I can go ahead and save my first part as G-code. We'll go back to prepare and we'll set up a second print job. So we're going to remove this one. Let's clear these and open. Oops. Let's open the correct part here. We'll remove our base and we'll click on Arrange All Models. We'll put this guy in the center. And we can see that there are no red surfaces. There's nothing that is overhanging, so we won't need to worry about supports. We can definitely print this at the lowest quality setting since all of the sides just go straight up, which means increasing the quality by decreasing the layer height is only going to make the layer lines a little bit less prominent on the sides here. It won't really change the structure of our print. Now we have a 4-hour print for the rest of this. And when we look at our preview, you can see the important thing about printing it sideways, aside from making us not need supports, is the fact that our outside shell is going to be printed as one long line all the way around in this direction. The inside is going to be supported by this 3-dimensional grid. And the grid on the inside doesn't really matter what direction it faces. But this will mean that the layers, the weakest part is in between the layers, is going to be running in the direction that we are putting stress on it. So it's unlikely that something is going to try to split this straight through the middle, and since we're going to be hanging something off of this hook here. This will be the strongest direction to print our part, so we'll save that, and we'll have two separate G-code files. We can rename them so that we know which one is the base and which one is the stand here. Rename our previous one to base. And now I have the stand and the base ready to print.